13-year-old Eric Martinez sat in the juvenile courtroom in Hidalgo County, Texas, on November 15, 2017. Wearing an oversized dress shirt and tie his aunt had brought for the sentencing hearing, his face expressionless and his posture slouched, as District Judge Noe Gonzalez reviewed the pre-sentencing report detailing the brutal murder Eric had committed 7 months earlier. The stabbing death of 68-year-old Maria Hernandez, a retired elementary school teacher who lived alone in the modest house next door to Eric's family in Mission, Texas, and who Eric had attacked on April 2, 2017, stabbing her 32 times with a kitchen knife during a burglary that netted him less than $100 in cash and some jewelry Eric had planned to sell for video game money. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. Throughout the 4-month investigation and 3-month trial that followed Eric's arrest, the young teenager had displayed a shocking lack of remorse that disturbed everyone who encountered him, from the police detectives who interviewed him and watched him casually describe stabbing his elderly neighbor to death, with the same tone most kids would use to describe their day at school, to the prosecutors who heard him laugh during a recorded jailhouse phone call when a friend asked if the murder had been scary, and Eric responded, "Nah, it was easier than I thought it would be," to his own defense attorneys, who struggled to present a sympathetic case for a client who seemed completely indifferent to the life he had taken and the decades-long prison sentence he was facing. Even the court-appointed psychologist who evaluated Eric, Dr. Sandra Lopez, had concluded in her report that Eric displayed concerning antisocial traits including lack of empathy, absence of remorse, callous disregard for others' suffering, and what appears to be an emerging conduct disorder that, if left untreated, will likely progress to full antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. As family members of Maria Hernandez prepared to deliver victim impact statements describing the grandmother, mother, sister, and friend they had lost to Eric's senseless violence, observers in the crowded courtroom expected Judge Gonzalez to impose a harsh sentence, likely the maximum available under Texas juvenile law, which would mean certification as an adult and decades in prison. What no one in that courtroom anticipated, what would make headlines across Texas and spark intense debate about juvenile justice reform, was that Judge Gonzalez would do something virtually unprecedented in Texas criminal courts. He would sentence Eric Martinez not to decades in adult prison, as prosecutors had requested, and as the brutality of the crime seemed to warrant, but to an intensive therapeutic program at a specialized juvenile rehabilitation facility, with the possibility of release at age 19, if Eric successfully completed treatment and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. A sentence that would either prove to be a transformative intervention that saved a troubled child from a life of crime, or a catastrophic failure of justice that would put a dangerous predator back on the streets after just 6 years, ready to kill again. Eric Daniel Martinez was born on August 15, 2003, in McAllen, Texas, a border city in the Rio Grande Valley region of South Texas, to Carla Martinez, a 21-year-old single mother working as a cashier at a local grocery store and struggling with addiction to methamphetamine and prescription opioids. Eric's father, whose identity Carla never definitively confirmed, was not involved in Eric's life and may not have even known of Eric's existence. From the very beginning of his life, Eric was exposed to chaos, neglect, and trauma that would shape his psychological development in profoundly damaging ways. Carla's addiction escalated rapidly during Eric's infancy and toddler years, She would disappear for days at a time, leaving baby Eric with various friends, boyfriends, or sometimes alone in their apartment while she went on drug binges. Child Protective Services was called multiple times by neighbors who heard Eric crying for hours, who saw Carla visibly intoxicated while caring for a small child, who witnessed concerning signs of neglect, including Eric appearing dirty, hungry, and unsupervised at very young ages. CPS investigated, and on 3 occasions between 2005 and 2008, when Eric was between 2 and 5 years old, temporarily removed Eric from Carla's custody and placed him in foster care while Carla completed mandated drug treatment programs and parenting classes. Each time, Carla would complete enough of the program to convince CPS that she had gotten clean and was ready to parent effectively, and Eric would be returned to her custody. But each time, within weeks or months, Carla would relapse and the cycle of neglect would resume. This pattern of abandonment, removal, temporary stability in foster care, reunification, and renewed abandonment created in Eric what attachment disorder specialists later identified as severe reactive attachment disorder, an inability to form healthy emotional bonds with caregivers, stemming from the repeated experience of his primary caregiver being unreliable, absent, or incapable of meeting his basic needs. In 2009, when Eric was 6 years old, Carla was arrested for possession of methamphetamine, with intent to distribute and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. With Carla incarcerated and no father in the picture, custody of Eric was given to Carla's sister Rosa Martinez, Eric's maternal aunt who lived in Mission, Texas, about 25 miles west of McAllen. Rosa, 30 years old at the time, was married with 2 children of her own and worked as a teacher's aide at a local elementary school. She agreed to take custody of Eric out of family obligation and genuine concern for her nephew. But she was unprepared for the severe behavioral and emotional problems that Eric brought into her home. Eric, at age 6, was already displaying concerning behaviors that would intensify over the next 7 years. He was aggressive toward Rosa's biological children, hitting them, taking their toys, sometimes hurting them deliberately, and then showing no remorse when confronted. He had severe tantrums that could last for hours, during which he would scream, break things, and become physically violent if anyone tried to restrain or calm him. He lied constantly, even about trivial things where there was no apparent reason to lie, as if lying were his default mode of communication. Most troublingly, Eric showed signs of cruelty toward animals. He was caught several times hurting the family's cat, and on one occasion, Rosa found him trying to set fire to a lizard he had captured in the backyard. Rosa took Eric to counseling through a program available to children in state custody, and Eric was evaluated by multiple mental health professionals during his elementary school years. He was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, and reactive attachment disorder. He was prescribed medications to help manage his impulsivity and aggression, but Eric often refused to take the medications or would pretend to swallow them and then spit them out later. Therapy sessions were largely ineffective because Eric would sit in stony silence refusing to engage with therapists, or would tell them whatever he thought they wanted to hear without any genuine reflection or desire to change his behavior. At school, Eric was a constant behavioral problem. He was frequently suspended for fighting, for threatening other students, for defying teachers' authority, for vandalism. His academic performance was poor, not because Eric lacked intelligence. Testing showed he had average to above average cognitive abilities, but because he simply didn't care enough to do homework, study for tests, or pay attention in class. Teachers described Eric as unreachable, a child who seemed to exist behind an emotional wall that no one could penetrate, who showed no interest in forming relationships with peers or adults, who seemed to go through each day in a state of detached indifference. When Eric was 9 years old in 2012, his mother, Carla, was released from prison after serving 3 years of her 4-year sentence. Carla moved to Mission to be near Eric, renting a small apartment and initially trying to rebuild a relationship with her son. But Carla had not maintained sobriety or addressed her addiction issues in any meaningful way while incarcerated, and within months of her release, she had relapsed. Eric would sometimes visit Carla's apartment, where he witnessed drug use, domestic violence between Carla and her various boyfriends, and chaotic, unstable living conditions that reinforced his internalized belief that adults were unreliable and that the world was a dangerous, hostile place where you could only count on yourself. By the time Eric entered middle school in 2015 at age 12, he had developed a hard, impenetrable exterior that combined defiance, anger, and complete emotional detachment from others. He had few friends, and the peers he did associate with were other troubled kids who got into fights, used drugs and alcohol, and engaged in petty crime like shoplifting and vandalism. Eric began using marijuana regularly at age 12, and by 13, he was occasionally using other substances, including prescription pills he would steal from Rosa's medicine cabinet or buy from older kids at school. Most significantly, for what would eventually happen, Eric had developed a fascination with violence that went beyond typical teenage interest in violent movies or video games. He would spend hours watching real violence online, fight videos from war zones showing graphic combat and casualties, videos of animals being killed. He researched serial killers and mass murderers, reading about their crimes in detail and saving images and information about their victims. He drew disturbing pictures in school notebooks depicting people being hurt, killed, or tortured. And he began to fantasize about what it would be like to hurt someone himself, to have that kind of power over another person, to experience what he had watched in videos and read about in his research. These dark interests remained largely hidden from Rosa, who was overwhelmed trying to manage her own 2 children, while also dealing with Eric's constant behavioral problems and her sister's ongoing addiction issues. Rosa knew Eric was troubled. She could see his aggression, his defiance, his coldness toward others. But she had no idea that by early 2017, when Eric was 13 years old and in 7th grade, he was actively planning to commit a violent crime, specifically a burglary that might escalate to violence if the homeowner was present and tried to stop him. Maria Rosario Hernandez was born on March 12, 1949, in Reynosa, Mexico, just across the border from McAllen, Texas. She immigrated to the United States legally as a young woman in the late 1960s, eventually becoming a U.S. citizen in 1975. Maria worked as an elementary school teacher in the Mission Consolidated Independent School District for 32 years, teaching primarily 3rd and 4th grade and earning a reputation as a dedicated, caring educator who went above and beyond to help struggling students. She was particularly known for staying after school to tutor children who needed extra help, for buying school supplies with her own money for students whose families couldn't afford them, and for creating a warm, nurturing classroom environment where every child felt valued and safe. Maria retired from teaching in 2010 at age 61, looking forward to spending time with her family. She had 3 adult children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, traveling, volunteering at her church, and enjoying the hobbies she had never had time for during her working years. She was widowed in 2012 when her husband of 40 years passed away from cancer. And after his death, Maria made the decision to downsize from the larger family home, where she and her husband had raised their children, moving in 2014 to a smaller, more manageable house in Mission that required less maintenance and was closer to her daughter, who could check on her regularly. Maria's new home on Esperanza Street was in a working-class neighborhood of modest, single-family homes, small yards, and families who had mostly lived in the area for years and knew each other casually through neighborhood interactions. Maria quickly became a beloved fixture on Esperanza Street. She would walk each morning, waving to neighbors and stopping to chat. She attended the local Catholic church faithfully and was involved in various church committees and charitable activities, and she was known for baking cookies or pan dulce for neighbors' children, remembering their birthdays, and being a kind grandmotherly presence in a neighborhood where many families struggled economically and children lacked positive adult role models. The Martinez family, Rosa, her husband Miguel, their 2 children, and Eric, lived 3 houses down from Maria on Esperanza Street, having moved to the neighborhood in early 2016 when Rosa and Miguel purchased their first home. Maria had interacted with the Martinez family on multiple occasions. She had given the children cookies, had chatted with Rosa about teaching. Rosa worked as a teacher's aide and admired Maria's long career in education, and had occasionally seen Eric walking by her house or playing in the street with other neighborhood kids. Maria had no way of knowing that the sullen, quiet 13-year-old boy from down the street was watching her, observing her routine, noting that she lived alone and appeared to have nice things in her house, including jewelry that Eric had glimpsed through the window, and planning to burglarize her home. In late March 2017, Eric began actively planning the burglary of Maria Hernandez's home. He had selected Maria as his target for several reasons. She lived alone and therefore posed less risk than targeting a home with multiple adults. She was elderly and therefore would be easier to overpower if she was home during the burglary. She was close enough to his own house that he could walk there and back quickly without raising suspicion about where he had been, and he had observed through windows that she had jewelry, electronics, and other items he could steal and sell. Eric's plan was to enter Maria's house during the day when she was usually out running errands or at church, quickly take whatever valuables he could find, and leave before she returned home. What Eric didn't plan for, or perhaps on some level did plan for, given his documented fascination with violence and his later statements to police, was what he would do if Maria was home. Eric later told investigators that he hadn't really thought about it, and that he didn't plan to hurt anyone. But forensic evidence and Eric's own confession would suggest that he had in fact considered the possibility that Maria would be home, and that violence might be necessary to complete the burglary, and that on some level he was curious about what it would be like to hurt someone. Sunday, April the 2nd, 2017, was a beautiful spring day in Mission, Texas, warm and sunny with clear blue skies. Maria Hernandez attended morning mass at her church as she did every Sunday, then returned home around 11:30 a.m. She made lunch, did some light gardening in her small yard, and settled in to watch television and read in the afternoon. At the Martinez house 3 doors down, Eric told his Aunt Rosa that he was going for a walk around the neighborhood, a common occurrence that Rosa thought nothing of. It was approximately 2:30 p.m. when Eric left his house, and he carried with him a small backpack that contained gloves, a screwdriver in case he needed to force entry into Maria's house, and, crucially and disturbingly, a large kitchen knife he had taken from Rosa's kitchen earlier that day, claiming later he brought the knife for protection in case Maria was home and he needed to scare her into not calling the police. Eric walked down Esperanza Street toward Maria's house, trying to appear casual and unhurried, as if he was simply out for a walk on a nice afternoon. He passed Maria's house first to observe whether her car was in the driveway. It was, indicating she was home, which should have caused Eric to abort his plan, or at least reconsider. But Eric continued walking to the end of the block, turned around, and approached Maria's house again, this time walking up the driveway toward the back door, which was partially hidden from the street by a wooden fence and mature shrubs. Eric tried the back door handle and found it unlocked. Maria, like many people in this working-class neighborhood, where serious crime was relatively rare, often left her doors unlocked during the day when she was home. Eric opened the door and stepped into Maria's kitchen, and immediately he heard the television playing in the living room, confirming Maria was home. The smart thing to do, the thing any rational person would do in this situation, would be to immediately leave, quietly close the door, and abandon the burglary. But Eric didn't leave. According to his later confession, he stood in the kitchen for several moments, listening to the television and Maria's presence in the living room, his heart racing with adrenaline and what he described as excitement more than fear. And he made a conscious decision to continue with the burglary, despite knowing Maria was home. Eric moved quietly through the kitchen toward Maria's bedroom, where he believed her jewelry would be kept based on where he had seen jewelry boxes through the window during previous observations of her house. But as Eric entered the hallway leading to the bedrooms, Maria emerged from the living room, having heard a noise that prompted her to investigate. Maria and Eric came face to face in the hallway of Maria's home, and for a frozen moment they simply stared at each other. Maria in shocked confusion, trying to understand why Eric, the boy from down the street, was in her house uninvited, and Eric trying to decide what to do now that he had been caught. "Eric, what are you doing in my house?" Maria asked, her voice more confused than angry, not yet comprehending the danger she was in. According to Eric's confession, Maria's next words were, "Does your Aunt Rosa know you're here? You need to leave right now, and I'm going to have to talk to Rosa about this." Maria began walking toward Eric, apparently intending to physically escort him out of her house the way a teacher would handle a misbehaving student. But Eric, panicking at the thought of Maria telling Rosa and the consequences that would follow, likely juvenile detention, more therapy, more restrictions, made a split-second decision that would end Maria's life and destroy his own. Eric pulled the kitchen knife from his backpack. Maria's expression transformed from confusion to terror as she realized this was not simply a case of a neighborhood kid making a bad decision to sneak into her house, but something far more dangerous. "Eric, no, please don't hurt me," Maria said, raising her hands in a defensive posture, backing away from Eric toward the living room. But Eric advanced toward her, and what happened next was captured in forensic evidence that would later be presented at trial and in Eric's own detailed confession. Eric stabbed Maria the first time in her chest as she tried to push him away. Maria screamed, a sound that should have alerted neighbors but apparently didn't, because several neighbors later told police they had their windows closed and air conditioning running and heard nothing. Maria stumbled backward, clutching at the wound in her chest, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Eric stabbed her again, and again, and again. Maria fell to the floor in her living room, landing on her back, still conscious and still begging Eric to stop. "Please, I won't tell anyone, please just leave," Maria cried, her voice weakening as blood loss and shock began to overwhelm her system. But Eric didn't stop. According to his confession and the forensic evidence, Eric continued stabbing Maria even after she was on the floor, even after she stopped moving, even after it was abundantly clear she posed no threat to him and was dying or already dead. The medical examiner who performed Maria's autopsy counted 32 stab wounds on her body, in her chest, abdomen, neck, arms and hands. At least 8 of the wounds were defensive injuries, where Maria had raised her hands and arms trying to block the knife or grab it away from Eric. Multiple wounds had penetrated deep into Maria's chest cavity, piercing her heart, lungs, and liver. The cause of death was sharp force trauma, resulting in massive blood loss and organ damage. Essentially, Maria had bled to death from the multiple stab wounds while lying on her living room floor. Eric stood over Maria's body for several moments after she stopped moving, breathing heavily from the physical exertion of the sustained attack, covered in Maria's blood. According to Eric's confession, his immediate thought wasn't horror at what he had just done, or concern for the elderly woman bleeding to death at his feet. It was pragmatic calculation about what to do next to avoid getting caught. Eric searched Maria's bedroom, taking jewelry and cash he found in her dresser and nightstand. He also took Maria's cell phone, apparently thinking this might delay discovery of her body if she couldn't call for help, though she was already dead or dying by this point. In total, Eric stole approximately $80 in cash and costume jewelry, worth perhaps $50, a pathetically small amount, for which Maria Hernandez had lost her life. Eric then attempted to clean up evidence of his presence. He wiped down surfaces he thought he had touched, trying to remove fingerprints. He used a towel to wipe blood off the knife, though this was largely ineffective and significant blood evidence remained on the blade. He changed out of his blood-soaked shirt and replaced it with a clean shirt from Maria's closet that had belonged to her late husband, stuffing his bloody shirt into his backpack along with the knife and stolen items. Then Eric left Maria's house through the back door he had entered, closing it behind him, and walked back down Esperanza Street toward his own house, arriving home around 3:45 p.m., roughly 75 minutes after he had left. Rosa was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Eric returned home. She asked Eric where he had been and what he had been doing. Routine questions she asked when Eric went out. Eric responded casually that he had just been walking around, had talked to some kids at the park, normal teenage Sunday afternoon activities. Rosa noticed nothing unusual about Eric's demeanor or appearance. He had hidden his bloody clothing in his backpack, had washed blood off his hands and arms at Maria's house before leaving, and she had no reason to suspect her nephew had just committed murder 3 houses away. Eric went to his room, hid his backpack with the murder weapon and bloody clothing in the back of his closet, and then did something that would later disturb everyone who learned about it. He played video games for the rest of the afternoon and evening, acting completely normal, eating dinner with the family, going to bed at his usual time. According to Eric's later statements, he didn't feel guilt or horror about what he had done. He felt mostly relieved that it was over and worried about getting caught, but not particularly upset about Maria being dead. Maria Hernandez's body was discovered on Monday morning, April 3, 2017, by her daughter Carmen, who had become concerned when Maria didn't answer phone calls or texts Sunday evening and Monday morning. Carmen drove to her mother's house around 9:30 a.m. and found the back door closed but unlocked. She entered calling for her mother and found Maria's body in the living room, surrounded by dried blood, her skin pale and cold, indicating she had been deceased for many hours. Carmen's screams brought neighbors running, and 911 was called at 9:37 a.m. Mission Police Department officers arrived within minutes and immediately secured the scene as a homicide. Detectives from the Criminal Investigations Division were called in, and a full forensic investigation began. The scene told a clear story. Maria had been attacked in her home, had attempted to defend herself based on the defensive wounds and distribution of blood evidence, and had died from multiple stab wounds. The presence of ransacked bedroom drawers and missing jewelry suggested robbery as a possible motive, but the extreme violence, 32 stab wounds, suggested something beyond a simple burglary gone wrong. Detective Carlos Ramirez, a 20-year veteran of the Mission PD and lead investigator on the case, began working the case with the assumption that this was likely someone Maria knew, given the lack of forced entry and the personal nature of the attack. Detectives interviewed Maria's family, friends, and neighbors, trying to establish who might have wanted to harm her and who had access to her home. Everyone interviewed described Maria as a kind, gentle woman with no enemies, no conflicts with anyone, no reason anyone would want to hurt her. The forensic evidence collected from the scene would prove crucial. Crime scene technicians found bloody fingerprints on walls and furniture in Maria's house, prints that didn't match Maria and therefore likely belonged to her killer. They found the towel Eric had used to wipe the knife, which still contained trace amounts of blood. They found fibers and other trace evidence that could potentially be matched to a suspect's clothing. Most importantly, they found shoe prints in Maria's blood that had distinct tread patterns that could be matched to specific footwear. Detective Ramirez made the decision to interview all male residents within several blocks of Maria's house, operating on the theory that the killer likely lived nearby, given the lack of a vehicle observed at the scene and the fact that the attack occurred in the afternoon when a stranger walking through the neighborhood might have been noticed. On Tuesday, April 4th, 2017, detectives began systematically interviewing neighbors, and that afternoon they knocked on the door of the Martinez residence. Rosa invited the detectives inside and explained that she lived in the house with her husband, their 2 children, and her nephew Eric. Detectives asked to speak with Eric, who came downstairs from his room, appearing calm and unsuspecting. Detective Ramirez asked Eric if he had known Maria Hernandez, and Eric said yes, she was a neighbor who lived down the street. When Ramirez asked if Eric had seen or heard anything unusual on Sunday, Eric said no. He had been out walking in the afternoon but hadn't noticed anything. But Detective Ramirez noticed something significant. The shoes Eric was wearing had a distinctive tread pattern that looked similar to the bloody shoe prints found at Maria's house. Ramirez asked Eric if he would be willing to come to the police station to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample that could be used to eliminate him as a suspect. Eric agreed, likely believing that refusing would make him look guilty, and he and Rosa drove to the Mission Police Department, where Eric provided fingerprints and a DNA swab. Within hours, the fingerprint analysis came back with a match. Eric's fingerprints matched multiple bloody prints found at Maria's crime scene. When Detective Ramirez and other investigators returned to the Martinez house with a search warrant that evening, they found Eric's backpack hidden in his closet containing the murder weapon, a kitchen knife with Maria's blood still on the blade and Eric's fingerprints on the handle. along with Eric's blood-soaked clothing and the jewelry and cash stolen from Maria's house. Eric Martinez was arrested on the evening of April 4th, 2017, and charged with capital murder, murder committed during the course of a robbery. Under Texas law, 13-year-olds cannot be charged as adults automatically, but prosecutors can seek certification to try juveniles age 14 and older as adults, or can seek determinate sentencing in juvenile court that can extend into adulthood. Given Eric's age, just 13, prosecutors initially charged him in juvenile court, but indicated they would seek the harshest possible juvenile sentence and would evaluate whether to seek adult certification as the case proceeded. With Rosa and a court-appointed attorney present, Eric was interviewed by Detective Ramirez at the police station. The interview, which was video recorded and would later be played at trial, showed Eric's shocking lack of emotion or remorse as he described killing Maria Hernandez. When Ramirez confronted Eric with the evidence, his fingerprints at the scene, the murder weapon found in his room, the stolen items, Eric initially claimed he had found those items and didn't know how they got in his backpack. But when Ramirez explained that this story was impossible given the forensic evidence, Eric changed his story and admitted he had killed Maria. "I went to her house to steal some stuff," Eric said in the recorded confession, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. "She came home, or she was already there. I don't remember exactly. She saw me, and she was going to tell my aunt, so I had to stop her. I didn't really plan to kill her, but then I had the knife, and she was yelling, so I stabbed her. I kept stabbing her until she stopped moving." When Detective Ramirez asked Eric how he felt about killing Maria, Eric shrugged and said, "I don't know. Bad, I guess. It's not like I wanted to do it, but I didn't really have a choice." This response, "I didn't really have a choice," became a focal point for prosecutors as evidence of Eric's inability to take responsibility for his actions and his lack of genuine remorse. Eric had absolutely had a choice at multiple points. He could have chosen not to break into Maria's house. He could have chosen to leave immediately when he realized she was home. He could have chosen not to pull out a knife when she discovered him. He could have chosen to stab her once in panic and then flee rather than stabbing her 32 times. But Eric's narrative framed himself as a victim of circumstances rather than someone who had made deliberate choices that resulted in a brutal murder. The case against Eric Martinez proceeded through the juvenile justice system over the next 7 months as both sides prepared for what everyone expected would be a contested trial. But in October 2017, facing overwhelming evidence and on the advice of his defense attorneys, Eric entered a plea of guilty to capital murder in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek adult certification, meaning Eric would be sentenced in juvenile court rather than as an adult. Under Texas juvenile law, the maximum sentence a juvenile can receive is determinate sentencing up to 40 years, beginning in juvenile facilities and potentially transferring to adult prison at age 19, depending on behavior and rehabilitation progress. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 15, 2017, and it would prove to be one of the most emotional and controversial hearings in Hidalgo County juvenile court history. The hearing began with victim impact statements from Maria Hernandez's family. Her daughter Carmen took the stand first, describing through tears the mother she had lost. "My mother was the kindest, most generous person I have ever known," Carmen said, her voice breaking. "She dedicated her life to teaching children, to helping families in our community, to making the world a better place. She retired looking forward to spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to traveling, to enjoying life after 40 years of hard work. Instead, she was murdered in her own home by a child she had shown kindness to, a neighbor she had baked cookies for, someone she probably would have helped if he had just asked her instead of breaking into her house and killing her. Carmen looked directly at Eric, who sat at the defense table staring down at his hands, and continued, "Eric Martinez stabbed my mother 32 times. 32 times. She begged him to stop. She told him she wouldn't tell anyone. She just wanted him to leave. But he kept stabbing her. He watched her die on the floor of her living room. And then he stole $80 and some costume jewelry and went home and played video games like he had just had a normal day. He has never apologized. He has never shown any remorse. He said in his confession that he didn't really have a choice. That's a lie. He had dozens of choices, and at every point he chose violence. He chose to murder my mother, and he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did." Other family members followed with similar statements describing Maria's positive impact on countless students during her teaching career, her devotion to her family, her involvement in her church and community, and the devastating impact her murder had on all who knew and loved her. Throughout these statements, Eric sat motionless at the defense table, his expression blank, showing no visible emotional reaction to the descriptions of the woman he had killed and the pain he had caused her family. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Laura Gonzalez, presented their sentencing recommendation: 40 years, the maximum available under Texas juvenile law, with Eric beginning his sentence in a Texas Juvenile Justice Department facility and transferring to adult prison at age 19. Gonzalez argued that the brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, Eric's lack of remorse, and expert testimony about his antisocial traits and poor prognosis for rehabilitation all warranted the harshest possible sentence. "Your Honor," Gonzalez said, "Eric Martinez committed an atrociously brutal murder. He stabbed a 68-year-old woman 32 times in her own home. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or an accident or even a single impulsive act of violence. This was sustained brutality that lasted several minutes, during which Eric had numerous opportunities to stop, but chose to continue stabbing, even after Mrs. Hernandez was on the ground dying. And since his arrest, Eric has shown absolutely no genuine remorse. He has never apologized to Mrs. Hernandez's family. His confession was matter-of-fact and devoid of empathy. Dr. Lopez's psychological evaluation concluded that Eric has antisocial traits and lacks the capacity for empathy that would be necessary for true rehabilitation. The only appropriate sentence is 40 years. Then it was the defense's turn to present their case for a more lenient sentence. Eric's attorney, Maria Santos, from the Public Defender's Office, faced an extraordinarily difficult task. She couldn't argue that Eric was innocent or that the crime wasn't serious. The evidence was overwhelming and the brutality undeniable. Instead, she focused on Eric's age, his traumatic background, and the possibility of rehabilitation through intensive treatment. Santos called Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a psychologist specializing in child trauma and juvenile offenders, who testified that Eric's early childhood experiences, the neglect, abuse, repeated foster care placements, exposure to his mother's addiction, had caused severe psychological damage that manifested in his inability to form healthy attachments, regulate emotions, or develop empathy. Dr. Rodriguez testified that while Eric currently showed antisocial traits, at age 13, his personality was still developing, and with intensive therapeutic intervention. Over many years, there was potential for meaningful change. Eric is still a child, Dr. Rodriguez testified. His brain is not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control, understanding consequences, and emotional regulation. The trauma he experienced during his critical early developmental years has profoundly damaged his ability to function socially and emotionally. But neuroscience shows us that adolescent brains remain plastic, capable of change and growth in ways that adult brains are not. With intensive trauma-focused therapy, medication management, and a highly structured therapeutic environment, Eric may be able to develop the empathy and emotional regulation skills he currently lacks. Giving up on a 13-year-old and sentencing him to decades in prison abandons the possibility of that transformation. Santos then called Rosa Martinez, Eric's aunt, who testified tearfully about trying to help Eric despite his severe behavioral problems, about the lack of adequate mental health services available for a child with Eric's complex needs, about her belief that Eric could change if given proper help. But Rosa's testimony was undermined by the prosecution's cross-examination, during which she admitted that Eric had been in counseling multiple times and had shown no improvement, that he had refused to engage meaningfully with therapists, and that she herself was afraid of Eric and didn't feel safe having him in her home around her own children. The most crucial moment of the sentencing hearing came when Judge Gonzalez asked Eric if he wished to make a statement before sentence was imposed. This was Eric's opportunity to express remorse, to apologize to Maria Hernandez's family, to show the court that he understood the gravity of what he had done and genuinely wanted to change. His defense attorney had coached him extensively on what to say, but when Eric stood at the podium and began speaking, it became clear that no amount of coaching could make Eric express emotions he simply didn't feel. "I'm sorry for what I did," Eric said, his voice flat and his tone suggesting he was reciting memorized lines rather than expressing genuine feelings. "I know it was wrong to kill Mrs. Hernandez. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I'm sorry to her family." He paused and then continued in a way that horrified everyone in the courtroom. "But I also want to say that I had a really hard life. My mom was a drug addict and I was in foster care, and nobody really helped me with my problems. So I'm not saying what I did was right, but there were reasons for it. And I think if I get the right help now, I can get better and be a normal person." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs, and Maria Hernandez's family members could be heard crying and expressing outrage that Eric was attempting to excuse his actions and shift blame to his difficult childhood, rather than accepting full responsibility. Judge Gonzalez called for order and asked Eric if he had anything else to say. Eric shook his head and sat down, apparently believing he had delivered an adequate statement. Judge Gonzalez then took a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence and arguments before delivering his sentencing decision. When he returned to the bench, the courtroom was packed with media, community members, Maria's family, and observers curious about what sentence would be imposed. Everyone expected Judge Gonzalez to follow the prosecution's recommendation for 40 years. The crime was brutal. The victim was vulnerable. Eric had shown no remorse, and harsh sentencing seemed clearly warranted. But what Judge Gonzalez said next stunned everyone in the courtroom and would spark intense debate that continues to this day. "This case has been one of the most difficult I have encountered in my 23 years on the bench," Judge Gonzalez began. "Maria Hernandez was a beloved member of our community who dedicated her life to educating and helping children. Her murder was brutal and senseless. She was stabbed 32 times in her own home by a 13-year-old boy who has shown little evidence of remorse or empathy. The prosecution has recommended 40 years, the maximum sentence available under juvenile law, and I fully understand why they have made that recommendation. Mrs. Hernandez's family deserves justice. Our community deserves protection from dangerous individuals. And frankly, Eric Martinez's behavior throughout this case has given me very little reason to believe he is capable of rehabilitation. Judge Gonzalez paused, and observers in the courtroom assumed he was about to announce the 40-year sentence. But then he continued. However, Eric Martinez is 13 years old. He is not an adult. He is a child who suffered severe trauma and neglect during his critical developmental years, who was exposed to addiction and violence, who never received adequate mental health treatment for his complex needs. While this does not excuse his crime or diminish his responsibility for what he did, it does require this court to consider whether there is any possibility of rehabilitation, and if so, what sentence might actually achieve that goal, rather than simply warehousing a troubled child in our prison system for decades. Judge Gonzalez explained that he had spent considerable time reviewing research on juvenile brain development, trauma-informed treatment approaches, and outcomes for juvenile offenders in different types of facilities. He noted that traditional juvenile detention and adult prison, while providing punishment and incapacitation, typically do not result in genuine rehabilitation for youth with severe trauma and attachment disorders like Eric. Instead, these environments often worsen antisocial behavior and ensure that juvenile offenders emerge even more damaged and dangerous than when they entered. I have reviewed information about specialized therapeutic facilities that use intensive, trauma-focused treatment models, specifically designed for violent juvenile offenders with complex trauma histories. Judge Gonzalez continued, "These programs combine secure confinement with intensive individual and group therapy, psychiatric medication management, education, and development of social and emotional skills. The research shows that for some juveniles, not all, but some, these intensive therapeutic interventions can result in meaningful change and reduced recidivism compared to traditional incarceration." Judge Gonzalez then announced his decision. "It is therefore the sentence of this court that Eric Martinez be committed to the Giddings State School, a specialized juvenile facility operated by the Texas Juvenile Justice Department that provides high-security therapeutic treatment for violent juvenile offenders. Eric will participate in intensive therapy and treatment designed to address his trauma, develop empathy and emotional regulation skills, and assess his capacity for rehabilitation. This commitment will last until Eric's 19th birthday, at which time this court will conduct a comprehensive review to determine whether Eric has made sufficient progress in treatment to warrant release under intensive supervision, or whether he should be transferred to adult prison to serve an additional sentence." The courtroom exploded in reaction. Maria Hernandez's family members began shouting angrily that this was an outrage, that Eric was getting away with murder, that 6 years was nothing compared to the life sentence Maria had received when Eric murdered her. Prosecutors looked shocked, clearly not having expected this outcome. Defense attorneys tried to hide their surprised relief, and Eric himself, sitting at the defense table, showed the first visible emotional reaction of the entire hearing. A small smile crept across his face, quickly suppressed when his attorney jabbed him with an elbow, but captured by courtroom cameras and later broadcast on news programs, becoming the image that defined public perception of Eric Martinez as a remorseless killer who was being given a lenient sentence he didn't deserve. Judge Gonzalez continued speaking over the commotion, his voice rising to be heard. "Let me be absolutely clear about what this sentence means. Eric Martinez will be confined in a secure juvenile facility where he will have no freedom whatsoever. He will participate in intensive therapy, whether he wants to or not. His progress will be carefully monitored and documented. When he turns 19, this court will review comprehensive reports about his behavior, treatment participation, psychological evaluations, and risk assessment. If Eric has not demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, and I mean genuine transformation, not simply going through the motions of treatment, he will be transferred to adult prison to serve an additional sentence that could keep him incarcerated well into his 30s or 40s. Moreover, Judge Gonzalez added, his tone becoming stern as he looked directly at Eric, if Eric commits any acts of violence while in juvenile custody, if he fails to participate meaningfully in treatment, if he shows continued lack of remorse or empathy, those factors will weigh heavily in this court's decision to transfer him to adult prison when he turns 19. This is not a lenient sentence. This is an opportunity, perhaps Eric's last opportunity, to demonstrate that he is capable of change. If he squanders that opportunity, he will spend decades in adult prison. Court is adjourned. As Judge Gonzalez left the bench, the courtroom remained in chaos. Maria's family was surrounded by victim advocates and prosecutors, some family members crying, others expressing angry disbelief at what they viewed as a grave injustice. Media swarmed defense attorneys for comment, and Eric was led away by bailiffs to begin his sentence at Giddings State School, the facility where he would spend the next 6 years and where his capacity for genuine rehabilitation would be tested. The reaction to Judge Gonzalez's sentence was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Local media coverage was dominated by outraged commentary from community members who felt Eric had received a slap on the wrist for a brutal murder. Maria Hernandez's family held a press conference outside the courthouse where Carmen, Maria's daughter, said through tears, "My mother is dead. She was stabbed 32 times by that monster, and he smiled when the judge said he would only be locked up until he's 19. Where is the justice in that? He'll get out when he's 19 and have his whole life ahead of him, while my mother is dead and never coming back. This is not justice. This is a failure of our legal system." Victims' rights organizations condemned the sentence as inadequate and called for changes to Texas juvenile sentencing laws to ensure harsher penalties for violent crimes. Some community members organized protests outside the Hidalgo County Courthouse, demanding Judge Gonzalez's resignation or recall. Social media was filled with angry comments about soft-on-crime judges and coddling teenage killers. But Judge Gonzalez also had defenders, juvenile justice reform advocates, trauma experts, and some legal scholars who argued that his sentence represented a thoughtful, research-based approach to dealing with a severely damaged child who had committed a terrible crime. They pointed out that Eric would be in secure confinement for 6 years, not getting away with anything, and that the intensive therapeutic intervention might actually reduce the likelihood of him committing future violence compared to simply locking him in prison, where he would receive minimal treatment and emerge even more damaged. Judge Gonzalez made a courageous decision based on science and evidence rather than emotion, said Dr. Jennifer Wallace, a juvenile justice researcher at the University of Texas. Research clearly shows that adolescent brains are different from adult brains, that youth exposed to severe trauma can develop disturbing behaviors that look like permanent personality disorders, but may actually be responsive to treatment, and that throwing troubled children into adult prisons typically makes them worse, not better. Eric Martinez has been given an opportunity to prove he can change. If he can't or won't change, he'll end up in adult prison anyway. But at least this approach tries rehabilitation first before giving up on a 13-year-old. As of December 2025, Eric Martinez, now 22 years old, has been incarcerated for 8.5 years total, 6 years at Giddings State School from ages 13 to 19, and the past 2.5 years in adult prison after Judge Gonzalez's review in 2021 resulted in a decision to transfer Eric to adult prison, rather than release him. The decision to transfer Eric to adult prison came after an extensive review of his progress at Giddings revealed that while Eric had participated in treatment programs as required, staff reported concerns about the genuineness of his engagement and his continued lack of empathy. In his review hearing in August 2021, held shortly after Eric's 19th birthday, Judge Gonzalez heard testimony from Giddings staff, reviewed psychological evaluations, and interviewed Eric directly about his time in treatment and whether he believed he had changed. Eric told the judge that he had learned a lot about trauma and managing his emotions, that he understood his crime was wrong, and that he felt ready to reintegrate into society under supervision. But when Judge Gonzalez asked Eric specific questions designed to assess genuine remorse and empathy, such as asking Eric to describe what he thought Maria Hernandez experienced during the attack, or how he thought Maria's family had been affected by her death, Eric's responses were superficial and suggested he was providing answers he thought the judge wanted to hear rather than demonstrating true emotional understanding. Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic psychologist who evaluated Eric in 2021, testified that while Eric had made some progress in developing better impulse control and superficial social skills, he continued to show the antisocial personality traits that had been identified when he was 13. Eric has learned to present himself more effectively, Dr. Chen testified. He knows what people want to hear, and he can say those things convincingly enough. But when you probe deeper, when you look at his behavior with peers and staff, when he doesn't think he's being evaluated, you see the same lack of genuine empathy, the same manipulative behavior, the same concerning traits. My professional opinion is that Eric remains a high risk for future violence, and that he has not demonstrated the kind of transformative rehabilitation that would make release appropriate. Based on this testimony and his own assessment, Judge Gonzalez ruled that Eric would be transferred to adult prison to serve an additional 20-year sentence for capital murder, making him eligible for parole at age 39 after serving a total of 26 years for Maria Hernandez's murder. Eric's reaction to this decision was reportedly anger and a sense of betrayal. He had expected that by participating in treatment programs and saying the right things, he would be released at 19, and he felt the judge had lied to him about the deal. This reaction itself further demonstrated Eric's lack of genuine remorse and his self-centered perspective focused on his own situation rather than the life he had taken. The question of whether Judge Gonzalez's experimental sentencing approach was the right decision remains hotly debated. Critics point to Eric's transfer to adult prison as proof that the therapeutic intervention failed and that he should have been given 40 years initially. They argue that 6 years of intensive treatment changed nothing fundamental about Eric's character, and that the only result of the lenient initial sentence was to give false hope to Eric and add to Maria Hernandez's family's suffering by requiring them to participate in review hearings and relive the trauma repeatedly. But supporters of Judge Gonzalez's approach argue that the attempt at rehabilitation was worth making, that a 13-year-old deserved at least an opportunity to change, even if that opportunity ultimately wasn't successful, and that Eric is actually serving a lengthy sentence, 26 years total, that provides both punishment and protection for society. They also point out that had Eric shown genuine rehabilitation at age 19. His early release would have been appropriate and would have demonstrated that some severely damaged youth can transform with proper intervention, and that the fact Eric didn't transform doesn't mean the approach shouldn't be tried for other young offenders who might respond better to treatment. Maria Hernandez's family continues to grieve her loss and advocate for victims' rights. Carmen Hernandez has become involved in victims' advocacy organizations and speaks publicly about her mother's case and the need for tougher juvenile sentencing. The scholarship fund established in Maria's name has helped dozens of students from low-income families attend college, continuing Maria's legacy of helping children even after her death. Eric Martinez remains incarcerated at a maximum security prison in Texas, where he will stay until at least 2043, when he becomes eligible for parole at age 39. Prison records show he has had multiple disciplinary infractions, including fighting with other inmates and possessing contraband, suggesting he has not matured or developed better self-control during his incarceration. It is highly unlikely he will be granted parole at his first hearing, meaning he will probably serve significantly more than 26 years total. The case of Eric Martinez and Judge Gonzalez's controversial sentence raises profound questions about juvenile justice that our society continues to grapple with. At what age can we determine that someone is beyond rehabilitation? Do children who commit heinous crimes deserve opportunities for redemption, or do the severity of their crimes and the suffering of their victims outweigh considerations of their youth and potential for change? Is intensive therapeutic intervention a reasonable alternative to lengthy incarceration for violent juvenile offenders, or does it represent dangerous leniency that prioritizes offenders over victims? These are questions without easy answers, and reasonable people of good faith disagree passionately about where to draw these lines. What is not in dispute is that Maria Rosario Hernandez deserved to live, that her murder was a brutal, senseless act of violence that destroyed a beautiful life and devastated her family, and that Eric Martinez chose to commit that murder and bears full responsibility for his actions regardless of his age or traumatic background. Judge Gonzalez's decision to give Eric an opportunity for rehabilitation through intensive therapeutic treatment was stunning and controversial. Praised by some as enlightened and evidence-based, condemned by others as dangerously lenient. 8 years later, with Eric still incarcerated and facing decades more in prison, after failing to demonstrate genuine rehabilitation, the question of whether Judge Gonzalez's approach was right remains unanswered. What we know is that 13-year-old Eric Martinez showed no remorse in court for brutally murdering his elderly neighbor, and what the judge did next stunned everyone, for better or worse.